All right, everybody, good afternoon. Welcome to our Bible study today. Hope y'all are doing well. It's good to see you. Um, how about this weather, y'all? Finally, looks like September. So anyway, we're grateful to the Lord for that. So, today we are in Genesis 33. So if you've got your copy of the Old Testament, that's where I want us to look today. And as this story goes, the momentum has been building for Jacob and Esau to finally meet, and that's where we'll find ourselves in the story today. So, I also want to welcome those of you that are joining us online. We're glad you're here as well. So let's look at Genesis 33. So remember, Jacob has left Laban, and he's making his way home. Now, the interesting thing is the Lord has told Jacob that he has a home for him in Bethel. And so that is the place that he's supposed to return to. And we get that at the vision that Jacob had earlier in this story. And so Jacob's got this promise from God that he'll return him safely to Bethel. So now Jacob has decided to go home, but he knows he's got to meet Esau. And you remember he gets the note from his folks that Esau is coming, and he has 400 men. And so Jacob now has organized his family. He's sent gifts ahead to Esau. And so now we come to the time where they're going to meet up with each other. So look at chapter 33, verse 1. It says, Jacob looked up, and there was Esau coming with his 400 men. Let's let that sink in for a second, And remember, Jacob is limping. Remember, Jacob is no longer running. Jacob has a lifetime mark from the encounter with God. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the two female servants. He put the female servants and their children in front, Leah and her children next, Rachel and Joseph in the rear. He himself went on ahead and bowed down to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. But Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him and threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept. So, 20 years have passed. It's now the moment of truth, where these two brothers are finally going to meet up with each other. Last we've heard from Esau. The next time he sees Jacob, he's going to kill him. And Esau is a man of the field. Y'all remember that? He's a ruddy outdoorsman. Jacob is a little more of an urban cowboy kind of guy, a little different. And he stayed among the tents with his mom. But here's what is revealed in these first few verses. Jacob has a strategy. He sent all the gifts ahead, and now he organizes his family, and he puts the concubines, which are referred to in the text actually as his wives, but the servants of Leah and Rachel, puts them first with their children. And then he has Leah with her children, and then at the very end of the pack, he's got Rachel and Joseph. In other words, if things turn bad, the ones that he loved the most are at the very end of the line. Hopefully they can escape. But it's quite interesting, though, that Jacob decided, if you look at verse 3, he went on ahead. So Jacob decided to, instead of starting with his family, he would go ahead and meet Esau himself. And again, as best we know, Jacob is limping. And notice what he does. He bows down 7 times as he approaches Esau. Interesting, because if you go back to Genesis 27, Isaac is blessing Jacob. And in Genesis 27, verse 29, he says, nations will bow down before you. And so Jacob has that in his mind, and I'm sure that's a part of who he is, wondering how that's going to take place when he sees the blessing of Isaac actually lived out in his life. And so he bows on his way to his brother. Verse 4, Esau runs to meet Jacob. And then it's interesting little play on words in Hebrew. Remember, Hebrew is somewhat of a limited language, with all due respect. Most Hebrew words are built on 3 consonants and then their derivatives. And so the word abak means to wrestle. The word habak means to embrace. And so earlier we've had Jacob in chapter 32. The Hebrew word abak is used where he wrestles with God. And then in chapter 33, habak is used where he is embraced by Esau. So he's had 2 physical encounters, if you will, incredibly significant to him for presumably 2 different purposes. With God, he was wrestling. With Esau, he's been embraced. And remarkably, y'all, Esau displays a conciliatory tone. Isn't that fascinating? What has happened to Esau in the last 20 years? This is a man who was embittered toward his brother. And if you look at it from a purely human perspective, if you don't factor in all the machinations of the promise and the stewardship of the promise and the fact that God has chosen Jacob and all of those facts, those threads that are woven into the story, if you're just looking at it from a human perspective and you don't know all of that or any of that, Esau has reason to be angry with Jacob. He's been tricked by Jacob from an earthly perspective. That would have been his take. But for some reason, and it's interesting, we're not told why. We don't get Esau's journey. We're not sure what happened to Esau. All we get now is the fruit of whatever's occurred to him and the work of God in Esau's life, perhaps. But he has had some type of journey to grace and forgiveness that isn't chronicled in the book of Genesis, but it's given evidence here in this text. Then the next thing that happens is Jacob acknowledges the grace of God. So look at what happens in verse 5. Esau looks up and saw all these women and all these children, and he said, Who are all these people? He asked. And Jacob said, Well, they're the children that God has graciously given your servants. And the female servants, their children approached and bowed down. Leah and her children came and bowed down, and Joseph and Rachel all bowed down. And so Esau, 20 years have passed. What's happened to you? And Jacob says, Well, I left here with nothing, and I've come back now with all of this. And I want you to notice it's interesting the way Jacob words what's happened to him. It's very evident in Hebrew. Jacob refers to God's grace, which is the Hebrew word hanan. He doesn't mention the word blessing. The word blessing is a charged word between Jacob and Esau. Who could have said, What happened to me? Just what Dad said. I mean, you knew what was going to happen to me. I'm blessed. I got Dad's blessing. I'm the one that's going to have all the kids. I'm the one everybody's going to bow down to us. Here it all is. Enjoy it. Well, that's not what he did. Jacob doesn't even use that word. He shies away from something that I think he knew was relationally charged between these 2 men. And so he acknowledges the grace of God. God's been faithful to him. And I also like the honesty of Jacob because look at verse 8. Esau says, well, what's the meaning of all these flocks and herds that I met? And look at Jacob's reply. To soften you up. That's what he says. I was hoping to find favor in your eyes, my Lord. Just a term of honor, respect, humility. But this is an honest answer from Jacob. Why did I send all these before everybody? Well, I was kind of hoping, it would make you have a little softer heart toward me. Well, that right there, y'all, tells me something about where we are with Jacob now. Jacob, he was someone who understood the things that he needed to do. And so here he's just very honest and very humble, and he addresses Esau with honor and respect. And so it's a very interesting exchange. I appreciate the humility in Jacob, the fact that he doesn't rub it in Esau's face that he's been blessed. He doesn't even use that word. He talks about the grace of God and gives testimony to God's faithfulness. But he also I think what he's honestly saying is, I was nervous to meet you, so I thought maybe sending these gifts to you would find favor in your eyes. And I love Esau's response at this point. Look at verse 9. Esau says, well, actually, brother, I already have all that. I don't need all that. So you can just keep it. Verse 10, Jacob says, no, please, if I have found favor in your eyes, accept this gift from me. For to see your face is like seeing the face of God, now that you've received me favorably. Please accept the present that was brought to you. For God, once again, he doesn't say has blessed me. He uses the same word, Hanan. God has been gracious to me, and I have all I need. And because of that, Esau accepted it. So now Esau has given Jacob the grace, if you will, the gift of forgiveness. And now Jacob feels like he's also given a gift to Esau. Is it in some sense Jacob maybe kind of repaying the birthright? Does that make sense? In other words, is he sharing some of the wealth that he's received because of how God has been so good to him? Well, scholars debate that, as you might imagine. Was that a part of all this? Is this just a gracious offer from Jacob? Is this just a real expression of fear? All those questions are appropriate. And the short answer to that is we don't really know. We just know how it played out. And there was evidently already a soft heart in Esau before these gifts ever showed up. You know, there seems to be the idea that Esau had already made the decision to forgive his brother once they meet. Well, then there's the parting of the ways. And so now Jacob and Esau are going to part with each other, and this will be the last time. As far as we know, according to the text, they won't see each other again until their daddy dies. So they're going to spend a number of years now away from each other. But notice, look at verse 12. Esau is probably thinking, evidently, Jacob is now home. He will just come live with me in the southern part of the area of Canaan in what was called Edom, which was named for his family, and we'll just live there together. And so he says, let's be on our way. I'll accompany you. Now we have kind of a sense that maybe Esau didn't know who all would be with Jacob, but he brought 400 men with him to protect Jacob's family too. Does that make sense? That's how it feels now. It feels like Esau showed up with his entourage thinking, we're going to unite our families and I'll escort us all back safely to where we need to go. That is at least what some scholars think is going on here. But if you look at verse 13, Jacob knows that the promise he's received from God is to go live in Bethel, not to live in Edom, not to go to the southern part of this territory, but he's going to go north is his plan. But he says, my Lord knows the children are tender. I've got to take care of the ewes, the cows. They're nursing their young. Basically, he says, I can't drive these children. I can't drive these animals. We've got to go a lot slower. Look at verse 15. Once again, Esau says, well, let me leave a group of men to protect you all. Probably looking at Jacob, and Jacob is traveling with women and children and animals and not a large group of men. And Esau knows this territory really well, and he says, let me just leave you some of my men. Once again, kind of promoting this idea that some scholars think that that's why he brought them in the first place. But then Jacob says, why do that? Let me just find favor in the eyes of my Lord. And so Esau then leaves, and he goes back to Seir. Jacob turns and heads the opposite direction. Now, you know, you've got this one little note in verse 14 that's a little bit of it leaves a little question mark in the story. At the last phrase of verse 14, he says, until I come to my Lord in Seir. So Jacob seems to imply that he's actually going to go to Esau's home at one point. Best we can tell, that's not going to happen. But he at least says that may be somewhere in their life in the future, but that's not where he's going right now. Okay, so they part ways, and so they won't see each other again until their daddy dies. So what does Jacob do? Well, let's look at what he does. Look at verse 17. So Jacob then went to Succoth. He built a place for himself. He made shelters for his livestock. And this is the fourth time Jacob will name a place. So he will name this place Succoth, which means booths in Hebrew. Evidently, he built shelters for his animals, his livestock, and they stayed there for a little while. And he's actually north of Jerusalem now. So after he had come from Padam Aram, verse 18, that's the area of Laban, he arrived safely finally at the city of Shechem in Canaan. And he camped within sight of the city. And so he is going to now live in Shechem or near Shechem. So kind of an interesting decision. Why doesn't he go on to Bethel? Because that's where he's supposed to go. That's where God told him to go. God said, I'm going to return you here to Bethel. And so there's this idea that when Jacob goes home, he's going to go back to where the Lord had provided for him. But for some reason, he decides to stay in Shechem. Now, when you look at commentaries on this text, scholars are divided over that. There are some scholars who say this is an act of disobedience. Okay? And the reason some scholars say that is because of chapter 34. They're saying Jacob should have gone on to Bethel because you're going to get this really interesting story in chapter 34 where Dinah is going to get raped there at Shechem. You remember that story? We'll talk about it next week. So some scholars say, Derek Kidner is one of the ones who's written a wonderful commentary on Genesis. He says Jacob should have kept going. Well, we don't know for sure, to be honest with you. We know that Shechem is somewhat of a famous place biblically. Abram, before he was named Abraham, when he made his way into the promised land, this is one of the first places he stopped. He met the Lord there in Genesis 12, verse 6. And Abram stopped in Shechem and he built an altar there. So Jacob's grandfather built an altar on this very site. Okay? So notice that once he gets there, verse 19, for 100 pieces of silver, he bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, the plot of ground where he pitched his tent. So Jacob decided not only to live there for a while, he actually bought property there. Now, again, this area will be somewhat prominent biblically over time. At the end of Genesis, after Jacob had died, Joseph, of course, is in power in Egypt. And y'all remember that Joseph gave final instructions to his brothers. And he said to them, when I die and all of y'all leave, the implication was Joseph knew they were going to return to the promised land. You remember what Joseph said to them? When y'all leave, take me with you. Take my bones with you. Don't leave my remains in Egypt. I'm not an Egyptian. In spite of how he looked and the language he spoke, he said, I'm a Hebrew. Take my bones back to the promised land. So if you go all the way to the end of Joshua, the last of Joshua, I think it's 24, the last page of Joshua, verse 32, the Bible says they took Joseph's bones to Shechem, to the land that his daddy had bought, and they buried Joseph there. Okay? So this town right here, this area that Jacob is purchasing, will eventually be given to Joseph's descendants. And Joseph will be buried there. It will, over time, it will morph a little bit, and we think change names. And by the time you get to the New Testament, this area is in Samaria. So it's north of Jerusalem. And some people believe that this is also the town of Sychar. And that town is famous because Jesus stopped there in John 4. And y'all remember, he stopped at somebody's well. Y'all remember? Jacob's well. Now what's interesting about that is Jacob's well in Shechem is never mentioned in the book of Genesis. We don't know about that. But evidently, there were wells that were dug, to take care of both the people and the livestock. This was Jacob's land. Jacob bought it and gave it to his son. And so, I'm sure, as time progressed, a well that would have been located in that part of the promised land would have been affiliated with Jacob. And so, Jesus is going to stop there in Sychar, which is a Samaritan city, which most archaeologists say is Shechem. So, this is kind of a famous little piece of property here. We're going to have Jacob buying land there, and after he parts ways with Esau and settles, this land's going to be given to Joseph, his favored son. Joseph will be buried there, And one day Jesus is going to meet a woman at the well in that very place. So somewhat of a famous little spot in Canaan or in Israel. And then the last thing I would say about this text is we see Jacob's spiritual journey on display. Because look what the text says in verse 20. Just like his grandfather did many, many years ago back in chapter 12, he set up an altar. And notice he gave it a specific name, El Elohi Israel. What that means is God is the God of Israel. Now, who is Israel? Jacob. So Jacob is both making a comment about himself and about the future of his descendants. This is a prophetic word, but it's also a word about Jacob's understanding of his own life at this moment. The God that he met in Bethel, the God that he met at the Jabbok, is the only God, and he's my God. And so he sets up an altar here, a place to worship his God, who is the God of Israel. And he, I think what we see here with Jacob in this, on this one page in the Bible, we see a man who has had an incredible journey spiritually. He's humbled by life, and he demonstrates some humility in his relationship with Esau. He's honest. He basically says to Esau, the reason I sent all these gifts was to curry favor. He was honest about it. He had some sensitivity. He didn't rub in Esau's face the blessing. He avoided the word, which I think shows some spiritual sensitivity. He was a steward, just like his grandfather. You know, there were times when Abraham would say, we're going to buy this. I don't want there to be any discrepancy. This is mine. I've purchased it. Well, Jacob did that. He bought this property for his family. And then there's spiritual maturity on display. He marks this place as holy, acknowledging that he has a God who's led him and provided for him, been gracious to him. So he has an altar, and he names it on behalf of his God. So there's a spiritual journey here that's on display. It's one of the things I love about the story of Jacob. The story of Jacob and the story of Joseph are two of my favorite stories in all the Old Testament. Watching these two men grow and change and develop and mature spiritually, both of those men are encouraging to me, and I'm grateful for them. So let me just give you 2 or 3 points to consider today. First of all, let's talk about reconciliation, because that's what's happened in front of us. Genesis 33 is about reconciliation. I've learned this about reconciliation. It takes time, often patience, humility, and sometimes it's just the grace of God. Yesterday, I spent the day at First Baptist Richardson. We have and you know, it's funny, I was driving to Richardson yesterday, and I don't drive much that direction anymore. And I was sitting in traffic, and I thought to myself, I'm so glad I don't live in the Metroplex. And I thought, actually, I do live in the Metroplex. I just don't drive in it like this very often. So anyway, but there's a group of younger leaders in Texas Baptist life. A couple of them are pastors, associate pastors. One of them teaches at Howard Payne. And they've organized a new group called the Pastors Common. And it is for young pastors in the state of Texas, Texas Baptist pastors. And they had a retreat yesterday, or started Monday and yesterday, and they asked some seasoned veteran pastors to come. And so we had 75 young pastors there. And then you had me, Jeff Warren, the pastor at Park Cities, David Lowry, First Baptist Decatur, John Durham from Highland Baptist in Waco, Jacob Wells, First Baptist Plainview. Oh, there were several of us there. Anyway, we were on a panel, and then we had small groups. We had mentoring conversations throughout the day with groups of young pastors. It was very encouraging to me to see 75 young pastors and ministers come together to just learn about how to do this. But one of the questions that they asked the panel I was on, they said, how do you handle conflict in the church? And I was the first one to answer. I said, well, this will be a really quick answer. I've never seen any conflict in a church, so I'll let these other guys talk. So we talked yesterday a little bit about it, and I knew I was teaching this text anyway today. Or at least I thought I was. I wasn't sure. I had jury duty this morning, and but I got a note that I didn't have to go today, so I'm here with y'all. But Katie was ready. She was getting ready, just in case. But I knew that I'd already read through this text. But regardless, what I told them was, and what I would say to y'all is, my experience with it is, it's hard work. If it were easy, everybody would be reconciled, right? It's God's work because Satan always opposes it. So I know it's the Lord's work because Satan wants us to live as broken people with broken dreams and broken relationships. That's what he enjoys, and he's really good at it. And so it's hard work. It just is. It requires time. Sometimes, people say time heals all wounds. Well, y'all know that's not true. That's just not true. There's a whole lot that's got to happen to heal wounds. But time does help sometimes because emotions subside over time. That does happen, which is a good thing. But it requires the patience, humility, grace of God. And so what I told these young pastors yesterday, I said, here's how I usually approach conflict, particularly if I'm in it. I always start with step number one, I could be wrong. I always start there. And that'd be my recommendation to any of you that are in a conflict. You just might be wrong, as hard as that is to believe. And I told them that's always hard for me because I just basically normally assume that I'm always right. Second, you know how physicians take an oath to do no harm, right? So that's the second principle to me about reconciliation. Just don't do any more harm. The old proverb, if you're in a hole, quit digging, right? So just don't do any more harm. And then third, a principle that I usually abide by is that reconciliation is the goal, not always restitution. Context determines so much of that. What I mean by that is there are some people that want reconciliation, and what they mean by that is they are justified and they win, and then they're willing to be reconciled. And more often than not, that's the case. At least in my experience, it's been that way. And if you start out with the goal of reconciliation, or at least you find yourself eventually arriving at that goal, sometimes it's going to require restitution. Sometimes it's going to require an admission of guilt. Sometimes it's going to require apologies. All those things are factored in. But when you begin the process with kind of this idea that you're not moving because you are absolutely right and everybody else is wrong, well, that limits the mobility of the conversation or the relationship. Wouldn't y'all agree? And you may be completely right. You just might be. But it's hard work, and it requires a lot of dexterity, nuance. And we live in an era where it's becoming a lost art because we're learning how to just live angrily. It's a new skill that just seems to be really popular. And evidently, if you can gather enough other angry people with you, then you no longer feel the need to be reconciled to anybody. And I just feel like I watch that play out over and over and over. And it's in my society, it spills over into everything else. So I would just say, Christians, as people of God, we need to look for clues to how to be reconciled. And I think this story, the grace of God was evident. Esau had already had a soft heart. But I would argue that Jacob had a soft heart too by this time, or he never would have sent all those gifts in the first place. Right? He could have just told his family, here's what we're going to do. God is on my side, and I'm the chosen son, dadgummit. And I'm just going to show up and tell Esau, dude, shouldn't have sold your birthright. He could have adopted that position. But instead, now you may argue, maybe he did this out of fear. He was afraid. The Bible says that. But notice in the text, when it came time to actually meet Esau, he went first. Well, that says something to me about Jacob at this point. He didn't send Joseph, Esau didn't know who Joseph was, but he knew Jacob, and Jacob was the first one to show up. I think there's something there, y'all. Second thing I'd say about this text, the promise to Abraham, it's still on earth today, y'all. You and I are now stewarding that promise. It was given to Abraham and his family originally, but now you and I are children of Abraham. And that promise that was given by God to bless the world, and through all the world you'll be blessed, or people will be blessed through you rather, that whole messianic promise and fulfillment that we have now as Christians, that blessing is in our hands. And it's fragile because it's been placed in the hands of people who are just very human. I don't know if y'all have noticed it or not, but these people in the Bible are just very human. And they were given this incredible blessing from God. Think about it. God told Abraham in Genesis 12, I'm going to bless all the families of the world through your family. And Jacob's like, you talking about me and Sarah? Yeah, and all y'all's descendants. Again, you talking about me and Sarah. And all those years pass, and it's still just him and Sarah. But that promise was still there. And then eventually it's going to be given to Isaac. In Genesis 26, Isaac's going to have his own encounter with God. And God's going to tell Isaac, don't be afraid. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to bless your descendants. Jacob had that promise from God in Genesis 28. He said, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to bless your descendants. I'm going to bring you back here to Bethel. Well, that promise of redemption is now in the hands of the church, the people of God. We're just as human as they were. So that promise can be as frail as we are. And the fact that God's chosen to entrust it to us and people like us, it's an amazing story to me. And so even today, think about it. The redemption of humanity is God's desire and God's will. But at some level, he's put it into our hands. So there are people across the world who are depending upon us to steward and shepherd this promise, to ensure that they get to know about it as well. So it's a fascinating thing the Lord has chosen to do here. And then I would just say, finally, our spiritual journeys, they matter. They're all significant. I don't know how old Joseph was. I guess we could go back and figure it out. But do you think this left an impression on this family to see their dad take some of these steps? I'm sure it did. You think they didn't talk about it? They didn't have the internet or cell phones to occupy their time. I saw a photo this morning of people in the airport like 25 years ago when nobody had a phone, and they were just sitting around. Some of y'all remember that. What were y'all doing? Just sitting around. Just hanging out, visiting, reading, whatever. Going to an airport today. Nobody looking at anybody today. It's just everything's changed. Think about it. They didn't have all that, so guess what they did at night? They told stories. They told the stories of the faith. They talked about how God had worked in their lives. So if you think actions like this didn't matter, I'm telling you right now, I can only imagine these kids at night saying, hey, Dad, tell us about that time you met Esau. Tell us again what happened. How'd it go? So it has an impact. I think about my mom. Her mother, my grandmother, got married when she was, Cindy? 13, my grandmother. My grandmother was in an abusive home, and my grandfather, on my mother's side, fell in love with her, and he went and stole her out of that home. He came with a horse and carriage and literally took her out of that house, and he went and married her. And he was a good man, but he was a gambler and never really had a model in front of him of what a family was supposed to be like. And so he just lived that life. He wasn't abusive toward my grandmother, but he didn't take care of his family. And so they had 3 girls, and my grandfather was gambling, and he was spending his money in the wrong way. And one night, some men paid my grandfather a visit and sent him a message that he needed to change his life. And my grandfather ended up going to church, and he got saved at East Griffin Baptist Church. And my grandmother was pregnant with her last baby. It was my mom. And so my grandfather, when he knew that my mother was being born, he went out on the porch and he prayed for my mom's birth. And my grandmother had named all the girls. My grandfather just didn't name the children. And so my aunts were Nellie Mae and Daisy Bell and Bertie Louise. Now, don't y'all think my grandmother had had enough naming. It was time to do something different. So my mother was born, and my grandfather was now a Christian. This was brand new for him. And when they came out and said it's a girl, he held his Bible up and he said, well, I have found her name, Naomi Elizabeth. And if you don't think that change in my grandfather impacted our family, well, then you just don't know much about what happens with people's spiritual journeys. All of a sudden, that little family became a Christian family, and they all got saved at East Griffin Baptist Church, and they all grew up with a loving dad who actually learned how to follow Jesus, who had an impact on his grandchildren, people like me. And so you think these spiritual journeys don't matter. What I'm telling you is they're hugely significant. When people make these decisions spiritually, it has ramifications way beyond them. And so I'm so grateful we get to see these stories lived out in front of us. Jacob was on a journey. We're a long way from Jacob cooking soup one night and having a conversation with his brother. When you get to page 33, we're a long way from that Jacob. We have a whole nother man now. And this is a man who's humble and honest. And you can say, well, God chose Jacob, and this is how it was going to play out. But I've noticed that God lives in this partnership relationship with us, and we've got a role to play in it. Jacob had his role. Jacob needed to grow and learn and change, and that's going to happen to him, and we get to watch it play out, just like we're getting to watch it play out in each other's lives. So I'd encourage you, your journey, spiritual journey, is important, and it affects not just you. It affects people that are around you. All right, I'm going to stop right there. So those of you that are online today, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time, okay?